So our first example, we have a proof, of course, why not? We love proofs. And now we're going to see some of the vocab that we just learned and those definitions come into play about triangles. So example 1, we're given that SM and PM are legs of an isosceles triangle. So here's SM, here's PM, and they're legs. That means this whole triangle is an isosceles triangle. Well, what do you know about the legs of an isosceles triangle? They are congruent. So that's a congruency that we can go ahead and mark. Those two legs will be congruent. They also told us that MW, so this ray MW, bisects angle SMP. So here's angle SMP, and this MW, I'll go ahead and draw that in. Here's our MW ray. It's bisecting this bigger angle. Well, what does an angle bisector do? It gives you two congruent angles. So I'm going to go ahead and mark those congruencies. We know that this angle will be congruent to this angle. Alright, and we are trying to prove that W is the midpoint of SP. So W is the midpoint of SP. Now just to think ahead for a second, if we want to prove that W is the midpoint of this big segment, we need to prove that these two smaller segments are equal to each other. And once we know that, then we can say that that's the midpoint. So that's kind of where we're heading. Eventually we want to say that SW and PW are congruent. But that will be toward the end of our proof. Alright, so our statements. Here's first thing, given. We already know that. Now, when we looked at the figure and we said we had an isosceles triangle, that's when we went ahead and marked these congruencies. So that's going to be our second statement. We're going to say that SM is congruent to PM. And just make sure that you are writing these congruency statements in the proper order. Just otherwise, it'd be incorrect if we wrote MP instead of PM. Alright, how did we know that those would be congruent? We knew that because of our definition of an isosceles triangle. Okay, then we have this ray MW bisects that angle. That's given information. Well, once we knew that that was a bisector up here, that's when we marked these two congruencies. So we can go ahead and state those angles as congruent. So we can say angle SMW is congruent to angle PMW. How did we know that those two angles would be congruent just from the fact that this was bisecting? Well, that's your definition of an angle bisector. So all this vocab that we're learning, we can bring into these proofs. So our definition of angle bisector. Alright, so let's think ahead for a minute. We have one big triangle, right? But we also have two smaller triangles within. Now, the way that a lot of these proofs have worked is we have tried to prove the smaller triangles as congruent first, and then that allowed us to list a corresponding part as congruent. And at the beginning of the example I said we wanted SW and PW to be congruent. So we want to be able to say the two triangles are congruent, so we can use our CPCTC. So far we have a side and an angle. Do you guys see anything else that might be congruent in these two triangles? And hopefully you're saying, well, duh, that MW, that shared side, is congruent to itself. So our fifth statement is MW is congruent to MW, and we know that that's the reflexive property that lets us do that. Do you guys love this reflexive property yet? It's so helpful. Alright, just make this a little bigger. Alright, so now looking at our triangles above, we have a side, an included angle, and a side. So we have side, angle, side congruencies. So we are ready to say that these two triangles are congruent. So triangle SMW is congruent to triangle PMW, and that's from our side, angle, side congruency. Alright, so we're getting close. Now that we have the two triangles as congruent, now you can say that any corresponding parts are congruent. And remember, we wanted these two on the bottom to be congruent so that we could state W as the midpoint. So our next statement will be that SW is congruent to PW, and we can say that from CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Now we're ready to get our final statement, what we're trying to prove. W is the midpoint. Because these two segments are congruent, that means that W must be the midpoint, and we know that because that is the definition of midpoint. And there's our proof.